Hi, I'll continue with paragraph 13 from the chapter on the Mordent in Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's Versuch über die wahre Art, das Klavier zu spielen. Da wir gesehen haben, dass der Mordent, zumal wenn lang ist, bei lang auszuhaltenden Noten zur Ausfühlung gebraucht wird, so kann auch nach einem Triller in diesem Falle vorkommen. Man muss ihn aber durch die Teilung der langen Note von dem Triller absondern. Außer dieser Vorsicht würde es unrecht sein, unmittelbar nach dem Triller den Mordenten anzubringen, weil man niemals die Manieren hintereinander häufen soll. Nach der bei Figur 77 abgebildeten Ausführung eines Exempels ist also beiden Anmerkungen direkt widerfahren. Die Währung des Mordenten richtet sich nach dem Tempo, welches allerdings nicht geschwinde sein darf, weil man sonst dieses Hilfsmittel nicht nötig hat. Here's a quick recap of paragraph 7 from the chapter on Mordents regarding notes that are to be held out. Der Mordent wird bei auszuhaltenden Noten zur Ausfühlung gebraucht. Also trifft man ihn, wie wir bei Figur 74 sehen, über bindenden A, punktierten B und rückenden Noten an C. Something I might not have specifically pointed out when covering that is that notes that are to be held out are not necessarily notes that are in themselves long. And in paragraph 13 we can see Bach making a distinction in that instead of saying notes that are to be held out, he says notes that are to be basically held out for a long time. So in paragraph 13, instead of saying auszuhaltenden Noten, like he did in paragraph 7, he says lang auszuhaltenden Noten. Not all notes are to be held out. A staccato quarter note or crotchet, for instance, could probably be the shortest amount of time of its actual value that such a note is to be held. That's articulation. Articulation is essentially about utilizing the various degrees of length to which notes can be held, from their very shortest to their full or maximum length, or with the case of a fermata, beyond their maximum length. So, the best way to notice a player's use of articulation and variety of articulation is to pay attention to the ends of the notes, to how they end, and to how deliberate those endings are. A variety of articulation is there to be heard in the subject of Bach's Toccata in C minor, BWV 911, as I play it. articulation in the true way to play the piano, to which I include AC fingering and its finger position, is omnipresent. Even the final chord of a piece is articulated. And I would say with the combination of the true way to play the piano and AC fingering and its finger position, I would advise to first discover AC fingering and its finger position, because that is the key to being able to reap the benefits of what Bach is sharing. And AC fingering and its finger position will take you into the world of music. You'll escape the cage with that. And with Bach, with what Bach provides, it's like he's giving you a chance to navigate that. Once you escape the cage, you make your first steps into the world of music. And once you're in there, then Bach becomes your guide. And as far as articulation goes, it's not really that ever explained what articulation is. And I know when I was learning piano, going through as a teenager and doing piano competitions and stuff, I did a competition where I played a Bach prelude and fugue, and the adjudicator writes notes, makes a few comments about each contestant, and in mine it said needs more articulation. And when I didn't know what articulation was. I mean, as far as I was concerned, articulation was having staccato notes and slurs in what you play. And I didn't really get it, like needs more articulation. I think, well, how many staccatos and slurs can you have in a piece without it sounding ridiculous? So I never knew what articulation was. And it was never addressed really. It was more so then when I took harpsichord lessons. But it's still, basically articulation is the length of the notes, how long each note is, and there's various degrees from the very shortest length to the very longest that you can play a note. Like a crotchet can be slightly over half its length when you lift it, or you can hold it out its full length depending on where it is, and so there's all those degrees, and that's all articulation. So even in a chord, a final chord, you can spot a player's use of articulation alone from that. And you can see when I play a final chord, you can see my hands there until the very end, until it's over. So I am articulating that final chord. And so you can see, you as well will notice then in the roll of honor, like if you look at, let's say, Sokolov, not that I want to pick, again, I don't want to pick on him specifically, it's just, you know, it's like the prison thing. You know, if you want to establish yourself, you go after the top dog. So that's what I'm doing. I'm going after the top dogs. So when Sokolov ends a piece and he plays the final chord and he lifts his hands off the keyboard and then he uses the pedal to determine, you know, to influence the length, how long that final chord should be sounding. He is displaying poor articulation, or even, you know, non-existent articulation, because in reality, articulation doesn't exist in the cage. It's what you get in the cage from those who, you know, have you know, like the roll of honor understanding of articulation. What you get in the cage, when you see, what you see from the roll of honor is a crude imitation of articulation. So, or a crude impression. So they're doing an impression of articulation, but it's not actually articulation. And you'll see how many notes are played with where there is no attention given to the ends of the notes, and it's so bad that the public don't know to listen to the ends of notes. They're non-existent. In all the master classes you'll see a total disregard for how notes end, and it's never mentioned. And so the audience never learn to pay attention to the ends of the notes. But that's key to understanding articulation. When you start paying attention, especially in my playing, as I said, with the true way to play the piano, with AC fingering and its finger position, when you're in the world of music, and the pieces I upload, you are, what is to be seen is someone in the world of music. So reject my playing, reject my interpretations. You are as well rejecting what's to be gotten. You're rejecting the world of music. And I say that as a fact, as important information that pertains to the reality of the situation. Yeah, and so like I said, even the final chord will be articulated, and I say that because then it's an extreme version of articulation. It's just to show to what how far articulation is omnipresent. There is not a single note when you play, when you're in the world of music, there's not a single note that isn't articulated. And so the final chord is like the final chord of a movement with a fermata sign over it. That's like an extreme version of articulation. So syncopated notes, like those of figure 74C, are not necessarily long, but they are to be held out for their full length. That's their articulation. And there, the short mordent is used for the filling out of such notes, when they are not especially long. I said at the time that Bach could as well be talking about long mordents in the case of paragraph 7. And paragraph 13, in saying that the mordent, especially when it is long, is used with notes that are to be lengthily sustained for the filling out, supports that assertion. Incidentally, I could imagine that the bow coming from the D in figure 77 could be indicating that that D is a tied note. And if it is, why then did Bach make it a tied note? He made it a tied note to indicate that the D is a note that is to be held out. Because, with articulation, you could end up perhaps in certain circumstances holding that D for a little over half its value. So if Bach is talking about notes that need to be lengthily sustained, he's going to provide like a condition that guarantees that end result in his example. And how do you guarantee that a note is to be held out? You present a tied note, because that D cannot be let go until after, depending on what, like let's say a quarter note or a crotchet, that it's tied to another D after the bar line. You cannot let go of that D till that downbeat is felt. So that D has to be held out or sustained beyond that bar line. So it has to be sustained for its absolute full length. So that's why he indicated that that D is a tied note. Here's how I might recount what else I imagine Bach is saying in this paragraph. He's saying, did you know that it would be wrong to introduce a mordent straight after a trill? That one should never heap up ornaments in succession? You can do it though. You can introduce a long mordent after a trill. Remember that trick I told you in paragraph 8 about how you can divide up a long note in a tempo that's so slow that not even a long mordent suffices in its filling out? Remember that? Well, with that method, you now have a way to make the introduction of a long mordent after a trill possible. It wasn't before, it is now. It becomes an option without it violating the rules of good taste or of the good performance. Yeah, so that's how I'd recount it. First we see the example, and then in the bar following the double bar lines is the execution Bach was talking about. And I'd imagine the AD stands for adagio. As well, we can again see Bach using a long bow over the two bars to signify that the last bar is an alternative to the previous bar. So an alternative continuation to the E flat upbeat. So one can use the long mordent after a trill to fill out a note that is to be held out or sustained for a long time, like the D in figure 77, which is the tied note. But one must first isolate the long mordent from the trill by dividing that note the long mordent would be over in two. They might be the two comments whose correctness are met by the written out execution of the example under figure 77, perhaps. So that you can use the long mordent after a trill, but that you have to divide the note in two. They might be the two comments. Maybe. There is also, though, the comment of it being wrong to heap up ornaments one after the other. That would mean if we were to try the first part of the example and add a long mordent to the D straight after the trill from below that is over the E flat, we'd notice it not working, or we'd notice it not being as effective as the written out execution that comes after it, where the D has been split in two and the long mordent has been added to the second D. Bach might see the two sentences of the paragraph as being the two comments, where comment 1 is a two-parter. That the mordent can come after a trill, but you have to divide up the note, and that one should never pile on ornaments one after another. We could look at bar 3 of the aria of the Goldberg variations and think, hold on, there's a trill from above following a mordent. One should never do that. More context would be in order there. And here's paragraph 15 from the chapter on trills. Wir merken hier, some of paragraph 15. Wir merken hierbei an, dass der Doppelschlag über einem Vorschlage nicht leidet, dass die folgende Note einen Zierat bekomme. Figur 56. So that can be added to the rule in paragraph 13 for more context. One can imagine the length of time between the last note of the brace, what I call a turn, and the following short mordent. An insufficient length of time, according to Bach. Whereas, like with the trill from below over the E flat, the afterstroke of a trill is connected to the following note with the greatest of speed. So there's even less time between the last note, its last note, than there would be with the last note of the brace. And as Bach said in paragraph 21, all kinds of trills except the prattle trill have to be struck for as long as the value of the note above which it stands lasts. And given such circumstances, according to the rule of paragraph 13, and what he says here in paragraph 15 from the chapter on trills, another ornament shouldn't directly follow. But then, In paragraph 15, Bach goes on to say, Es sei denn, dieser Vorschlag vor einer Formate, wobei auch wegen des darüber befindlichen Zeichens länger gehalten wird, als seine Geltung erfordert. Die letzte Note von diesem Doppelschlage wird unterhalten, dass man also ohne Ekel gar wohl nach einem kleinen Zwischenraume in den darauf folgenden langen Mordenten hineingehen kann. A. That information could be an answer to that third bar of the Goldberg variations. That the tempo of the aria was slow enough for such a space of time in between the two ornaments. So a clue to the tempo and a clue to the interpretation. That the trill from above shouldn't come in straight after the mordent, meaning the mordent shouldn't be too long. Dividing up the long note is like what Bach offered in paragraph 8, as I've covered. So it's like what Bach offered in paragraph 8 as a possibility and could be seen as a means of variation. So another, again, to keep in mind when, if you want to vary a repeat. And as far as the trill from below is concerned, here's paragraph 25 from the chapter on trills. Also kommt dieser Triller, the trill from below, zwar überhaupt bei langen Noten, besonders aber am meisten vor Fermaten und Schlüssen vor. Außerdem aber trifft man ihn bei der Wiederholung der vorigen Note, Figur 36a. Im Gange B und nach einem Sprunge C vor einer hinauf- und heruntergehende Folge an. Bei langen Aushaltungen von einigen Takten, welche man durchtrillert, kann der Triller, wenn etwa matt werden wollte, aufs Neue durch diese Art von Trillern einmal angefrischt werden. Jedoch muss dieses geschehen, ohne den geringsten Zeitraum leer zu lassen. Folglich ist dieser Triller besonders den Fingern zuträglich, indem ihnen gleichsam neue Kräfte zu trillern gibt. Man kann durch diesen Triller ganz bequem ganze Oktaven durchgehen. Und die Fingersetzung wird durch die paar Nötchen, welche im Anfang angehängt werden, ein vieles erleichtert. In figure 77, we can see the trill from below coming in on the repeat of the preceding note. The following, in addition to what I just read, as well adds greater context to what Bach had in mind with his comment or his rule in paragraph 13. He is not thinking of trilling true when he says that one should never pile up ornaments in succession. There is the figure 28C. In the paragraph 13 rule, he isn't including when one trills true notes. Wenn viele Triller hintereinander gehen. And as I've said, gehen means to move stepwise. So when he says durch diesen Triller ganz bequem, ganze Oktaven durchgehen, means going stepwise through a whole octaves, entire octaves. So when he's saying one shouldn't pile up ornaments in succession, he's not talking about one trill after another. Just to, it's important to get it clear because it's so easy to run away with these rules. There's so many, it's a kind of like an easy angle where, there's a rule and a person can think they're going to distinguish themselves in that they obey the rule better than anybody else obeys it. And with that, without a proper understanding of the rule, they can do in obeying that rule while the rule might have its, might have its justification. And it might do good when it's misunderstood and when it's used beyond its scope or the range, beyond where it applies. It can end up doing more damage than good. And it can bring, people start going backwards. The general understanding, the general knowledge it starts deteriorating. And you come up with all sorts of ridiculous ideas and beliefs. Finally, regarding the length of time the long mordent is to be struck, Bach says it adjusts itself to the tempo. As another quick recap, Bach said in paragraph 1, sein Zeichen im ersten Falle ist Tab 5 bei Figur 72 nebst der Ausführung abgebildet. Jenes wird niemals verlängert, diese aber wohl, wenn es nötig ist. So, it can be lengthened, and regarding that, the value, the currency, the währung, it adjusts itself to the tempo. Okay, I'll leave it at that for this video, and I'll pick up where I left off in the next. Thanks. Bye.